She laughed at the humans' survival rules until a cactus changed everything. In the vast and burning sands of Araxis, one alien princess learned the hard way that humans don't make rules for no reason. She laughed at his gear. She rolled her eyes at his desert warnings. But the moment a venomous cactus went straight through her royal backside, everything changed, including her future, her beliefs, and the state of her womb. You're listening to Astro HFY, where aliens fall, humans rise, and love crashes harder than starships. Don't forget to subscribe for more cosmic drama, interspecies chaos, and stories that sting just like Araxian cactus needles. Commander Jalen Cross didn't join the Terran Alliance to become a glorified space chauffeur. He certainly didn't sign up to escort an interstellar princess with the personality of a sun flare and the patience of a melting comet. Yet here he was, strapped into the pilot seat of a beat-up Class 4 transport, cutting across the Vega sector with her radiant excellency, Lyra Valen, daughter of Ambassador Virel Valen of the Virelian Accord. And boy, did she know it. How much longer, she asked again. Her sixth inquiry in just under an hour. Jalen's gloved hands tightened slightly on the steering yoke. 6 hours. That's what you said 10 minutes ago. Because nothing has changed in 10 minutes, he said without turning. Lyra leaned over his shoulder, her silver hair brushing the back of his flight suit. Her skin had a golden-orange hue, like twilight caught in motion, and she smelled faintly of some floral spice blend that somehow made the cockpit feel smaller. This ship is quaint, she mused, eyeing the aging interface panel. My father's cruiser would have completed this trip in half the time. You should have taken Daddy's cruiser. Then, Jalen muttered, too quietly for her to hear. What was that I said? You might be more comfortable in the passenger quarters, he said stiffly. The entertainment system is... Well, it works. I've already seen your entire collection of primitive human media, she sniffed. What's a Shrek, and why does it make such aggressive use of the color green? Jalen exhaled through his nose. 3 more days of this. Just 3. He could survive it. He'd survived a hull breach during the Proxima siege. He'd floated in space with only a cracked helmet and 90 seconds of air. He could handle one stuck-up alien aristocrat with a vendetta against Terran humor. Then the alarm klaxon shrieked. A flurry of red lights blinked across the dashboard. What now? Lyra demanded, eyes narrowing. Jalen was already working. Main thrusters are losing power. Something's overloaded the secondary intake coils. We're going down. Down where he pointed to the looming planet on the display. Solara. That's our destination. Congratulations, he said dryly. You get the express route. As atmospheric resistance gripped the ship, the whole vessel began to shake. Flames streaked across the viewport. Lyra, to her credit, buckled into the co-pilot's seat without further commentary. Jalen toggled emergency protocols, hands moving in a practice blur. Brace. This won't be gentle. Neither am I, Lyra muttered under her breath. The ship slammed into Solara's atmosphere like a brick hitting sand. With a groaning protest from its aging frame, it bounced once, skidded, and finally came to a stop wedged slightly sideways against a rock ridge in a cloud of fine red dust. Silence. Could have been worse, Jalen said after a beat, undoing his harness. Could have exploded. I think I bruised something delicate, Lyra muttered, checking her reflection in a screen. Jalen ran a quick systems check. Life support functional. Hull integrity 68%. Comms damaged, but repairable. He stood and grabbed an emergency field kit, tossing her an environmental suit. Put this on. Solara's desert is full of nasty surprises. The floor is aggressive. Some of the cacti can pierce alloy plating. Lyra held the suit between 2 fingers like it was radioactive. This smells like unwashed socks and testosterone. It's clean-ish, and it'll keep you alive. I have sensitive skin. Synthetic fabrics give me hives. Your funeral. I'm not wearing that, she declared, tossing it aside. I'm just stepping out for air. 5 minutes. Famous last words. Jalen muttered. The airlock opened with a hiss, and a wave of hot, dry air hit them like an oven. Lyra stepped out as if modeling for a fashion magazine titled Goddess in the Wasteland. She lifted her arms to the twin suns overhead and sighed dramatically. Finally, natural light. I thought I'd fade into a pasty Terran ghost in that tin can. Jalen followed her out, visor down, scanning the area. The ship had plowed a furrow into the red sand, stopping near a cluster of towering blue-tinged cacti. "Be careful," he called. "Those cacti aren't just perfectly safe," Lyra interrupted, spinning with arms wide. "You humans are so paranoid. It's just a desert." Then she stepped backward, directly into the cactus. There was a wet schloop sound, followed by the kind of scream that might register on seismic sensors. Jalen turned to see Lyra frozen mid-step, eyes wide, with 3 luminous blue cactus spines sticking comically out of her left butt cheek. He blinked. She screamed again. "It burns, don't move," he barked, rushing forward. "You're making it worse. You said the armor could stop them. That's why I gave you the suit." "I didn't think I'd be butt-stabbed by a plant." Jalen caught her before she toppled, trying not to look too closely at the wounded area. "Stay still. I'm getting the med kit. And for the record, what I told you so." The last time Commander Jalen Cross found himself in a medical emergency this absurd, it involved a drunk ambassador, a bowl of poisonous berries, and a very aggressive goat on Altair 3. This was worse. "Don't move," he said calmly, already slipping on gloves as Lyra Valen writhed on the medical cot, her face twisted in agony, pride, and barely contained humiliation. "I can't not move," she snapped. "There are spikes in your royal posterior." "Yes," Jalen finished, crouching beside her. "And you'll drive them deeper if you squirm." I wasn't squirming, I was dancing with a cactus. Her glare could have incinerated the ship's hull. "Just hold still." "Let me work," he said, unrolling a med pack and setting out tools with precise military efficiency. The interior of the Hermes had been converted into a field infirmary more times than he cared to count, but never quite like this. The orange-tinged Varelian lay face down, hips turned slightly to the side, revealing at least a dozen blue-violet cactus spines embedded in the soft, delicate flesh of her upper thighs and, yes, her butt. He'd never had to perform cactus surgery on alien royalty before. Today was full of firsts. "This may sting a little," he warned, spraying a cooling anesthetic across the site. Lyra jolted. "Sting, it's frozen fire better than Solaran neurotoxin." "You keep saying neurotoxin like that's supposed to be comforting." Jalen didn't answer. He was too focused now, brows furrowed, tweezers in hand. One by one, he began extracting the spines, their iridescent tips curling slightly as if mocking him. They came free with unpleasant little sounds, schwick, schlick, pop, accompanied by hisses, gasps, and increasingly creative Varelian curses. "How's your pain level?" he asked. "Somewhere between burning meteor to the butt and ceremonial stiletto to the soul?" "Right. I'll mark that as a solid 7. Her fingers gripped the edges of the cot. "If this ends up in your mission report, I will personally program every urinal on your home station to greet you by name." "I think I'll leave this part out," he said, smiling despite himself. "But I might keep the audio." "For science," she groaned again, whether from pain or embarrassment. He wasn't sure. A sheen of sweat had formed on her brow, her silver hair clinging in delicate strands to her temples. Jalen's smirk faded. "Hey," he said softly, "you're running hot. More than just the sunburn." "Let me scan. Don't bother," she interrupted, voice tight. Jalen frowned, activating his portable scanner anyway. "You're showing elevated cortisol, heart rates climbing, temperature spiking by the minute." "Wonderful. What other indignity does this planet have in store for me?" He studied the readout, then went still. A new wave of data scrolled across the screen. Hormone levels off the charts. Glandular activity unusual. What the hell? Lyra closed her eyes, exhaling through clenched teeth. "It's the cactus venom. If it's a Solarin heat crown, and it always is, then it's reacting with my endocrine system. Meaning, meaning I'm going into a full biological reproductive cycle, she said flatly. Jalen blinked. Come again. Her eyes fluttered open. That would be the idea. A beat. 2 beats. Jalen turned slowly and placed the scanner down. Okay, explain. Slowly, preferably with fewer threats to my emotional stability. She sighed and rested her head on folded arms. Varelians don't have heat like some mammals. Our cycle is inert, dormant unless triggered by very specific stimuli, rare plants, pheromonal alignments, and apparently angry cactus venom. And once it starts, it has to run its course. 3 to 5 days, sometimes longer. Jalen rubbed the back of his neck, and the symptoms fever, heightened senses, irritability, mood swings, and she trailed off, clearly struggling, and he prompted, elevated libido, she mumbled. Jalen blinked. I'm sorry, did you say yes? All right, desire. Need, hormonal compulsion, and before you get any ideas, no. I am not interested in Terran cross-species experimentation. He held up both hands. Trust me, I've got zero plans for scientific romance. You're literally running a biological firestorm. I'm just trying to keep you alive. She eyed him warily. You're taking this well. I once had to sedate a mating pair of Andari diplomats who thought the negotiation table was a bed of roses. Nothing surprises me anymore. A silence fell between them, not quite comfortable, but not hostile either, just heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, Lyra shifted, her voice quieter. I'm sorry, Jalen raised a brow. For what? For being a brat. I've spent this whole mission complaining and criticizing while you've, kept us alive. That's my job. And you're good at it. He blinked. That almost sounded like a compliment. She added, also, I think I owe you an apology for the Shrek comment. The green one's actually kind of charming. That earned a chuckle. See, you do have taste. I still stand by my review of Friends, though. I'll allow it. Jalen checked the scanner again. Her vitals were holding steady for now. The venom was still active, but the antitoxin he'd administered earlier was at least slowing its progression. You'll need to rest, he said, gently pulling the thermal blanket over her hips. And hydrate. A lot, Lyra nodded weakly, her voice growing hazy. I didn't think today would end with a cactus-induced mating crisis. Neither did I. Jalen. Yeah, if I start hallucinating and try to kiss you or something. Yeah, just remind me I hate you. He smiled faintly. Will do. She exhaled slowly, already drifting. Within moments, her breathing slowed, her body relaxing under the sedation patch he'd slipped onto her skin. She mumbled something unintelligible, possibly in Varelian, or maybe just heat dream gibberish. Jalen stood slowly, watching her for a long moment. She looked different like this, softer, real, not the diplomatic mask she wore or the razor wit she wielded like a weapon. He rubbed the back of his neck again. Trouble, this was going to be trouble. He turned toward the hatch, stepping into the sweltering desert air. There was a comms array to fix, a distress signal to send, supplies to manage, and a rapidly overheating alien princess asleep in his medbay. Yeah, trouble had a name. And it was Lyra Vullen. At first, Lyra Vullen's fever dreams were tame. Colors danced behind her eyelids, amber swirls and sapphire spirals. Memories of starlit banquets and weightless gardens floating in Varelian orbit. But the dreams didn't stay pleasant for long. In one moment, she was standing before the High Council, her ceremonial robes pristine, her father watching with pride. The next, the chamber twisted, warped into 1,000 mirrored fragments, each reflection whispering the same phrase. Disappointment. Not enough, one voice said. Never enough, echoed another. You were supposed to be better, hissed a third, this one unmistakably her father's. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. I am enough. But the mirrors shattered. Darkness swept in. And then Jalen Cross was there. Not in uniform, not stern, just present. He stood in the center of the void, his eyes calm, voice low and steady. I see you, Dream Jalen said. Lyra reached for him, her fingers trembling. Do you, he nodded. Not the ambassador's daughter, not the spoiled diplomat, just Lyra. And in that moment, deep in her own burning mind, she let go of expectation, of duty, of fear. Meanwhile, Jalen was fighting a storm of his own, and this one wasn't metaphorical. Outside the Hermes, the temperature had plummeted by nearly 20 degrees in an hour. Dust readings were spiking on the environmental console. Solara's twin suns had vanished behind a dark red wall sweeping across the horizon. He checked the weather sensors again. Category 3 sandstorm incoming. Estimated arrival 11 minutes. Perfect, he muttered, punching commands into the auxiliary systems. Why not add apocalyptic weather to today's cactus-induced mating crisis? He shut the main hatch, sealing the ship tight. Outside, the first gusts had already begun to moan across the hull, an eerie, keening sound like the cry of some distant predator. Lights flickered. Power dropped by 8%. Inside the medbay. Lyra stirred. He entered quietly, crouching beside her cot. Her skin glistened with fever sweat. Her silver hair clung to her cheeks. She murmured something in Varelian, then switched to English unaware. Don't leave. Jalen's jaw tightened. I'm not going anywhere, he said softly. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, hot. Too hot. The antitoxin was slowing the venom, but not stopping the effects. Her body was reacting exactly as she said it would. He considered the vial in his hand, the hormonal stabilizer he'd pulled from the medkit earlier. It could ease her symptoms. Maybe even knock the reproductive cycle back a few stages. But he looked at Lyra again. This wasn't just biology. It was culture, belief. She'd made it clear interfering with the cycle was sacrilege to her people. He placed the vial aside. Her eyes fluttered open. Jalen, she rasped. I'm here. Her gaze was hazy, unfocused. I saw you in my dreams. You weren't so grumpy there. He chuckled. Dreamy sounds charming. You kissed me. He blinked. And you said, she continued, her voice slurring. You're more than just a mission. Jalen rubbed his neck awkwardly. Well, Dreamy has a way with words. She laughed weakly. You're kind, under the sarcasm. Don't spread that around, he said, adjusting her blanket. Ruins my image. Another gust hit the ship. This time, the walls vibrated. Red warning lights flashed. External integrity compromised. Temperature dropping. He cursed under his breath and checked the environmental feed. The external solar collectors were buried. Power was down to 42%. We've got a problem, he muttered, turning to her. The storm's going to cut life support if we don't conserve energy. I can help, she said, struggling to sit up. Jalen moved to steady her. Whoa, no, you're barely upright. I'm Varelian, she said through gritted teeth. Not a paper doll. Right now, you're a heat-stricken alien with cactus trauma. Sit down. She gave him a weak glare, but didn't argue. He ran a few more diagnostics, shutting down non-essential systems. As the lights dimmed to emergency glow, the medbay took on an almost intimate hue. Lyra pulled the blanket tighter. It's cold. It'll get colder. He paused. There's something else we can do. She raised an eyebrow. Body heat, he said. Military protocol. It's not weird, just practical, she smirked, even half delirious. Are you asking to cuddle? Commander Cross, I'm asking to not freeze to death. If you're going to assign meaning to it, that's your issue. She laughed a soft, exhausted sound, but patted the space beside her on the cot. Come on, hero. Let's survive together. He hesitated for only a second, then sat down, carefully, slowly. He pulled the thermal blanket around them both. Her body radiated heat like a furnace, even through the blanket. You're burning up, he murmured. It's the cycle. She rested her head against his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. For a long while, neither spoke. The storm howled around them like a beast unleashed. Dust scraped against the hull. Power flickered once, then stabilized. Inside, cocooned in silence and warmth. Jalen became acutely aware of the woman curled beside him, not the diplomat's daughter, not the sarcastic noble, just Lyra. And for the first time since their mission began, he wasn't thinking about rules, or orders, or what came next. Only now. She shifted slightly, her voice barely a whisper. Jalen, yeah, if I survive this, and you tell anyone about the cactus, I will end you. He smiled, duly noted, but in truth, he'd never forget it. Not because it was hilarious, it was, but because the moment that Cactus struck was the exact moment everything changed. When Jalen Cross woke, the first thing he noticed was that he couldn't feel his feet. The second was the weight pressed against his chest and the cascade of silver hair spread across it. For one surreal moment, he thought he was still in a fever dream. Then Lyra Valen stirred. Ugh. She groaned softly, her voice muffled against his shirt. Why does it smell like sweat and regret in here? Jalen blinked, brain still rebooting. It's your cycle, and the fact that we're using a military blanket from the year 2211. Lyra lifted her head, bleary-eyed. You're warm. You're boiling. Together we make something vaguely survivable. Outside, the sandstorm was still in full fury, sheets of crimson dust battering the Hermes with relentless force. The ship groaned like a beast trying to hold itself together. Inside, silence settled between them. It wasn't awkward, just fragile. Lyra sat up slowly, pressing a hand to her forehead. How bad's the storm? Jalen checked the external sensors. Still has a few hours left in it. Wind speeds dropped slightly, but the collectors are still buried. We're running on reserve. Enough to get to the capital, enough to breathe and eat protein paste. That's it. She glanced toward the cockpit, her brow furrowing. We're stuck. Correct. And she paused, looking down at herself, still radiating enough heat to fry a Terran egg. He gave her a sidelong look. Feeling better or worse, hard to say. I don't want to throw up anymore, which is an upgrade, but everything still feels tight, tight. She flushed just a little, like my skin doesn't fit, like I need to move or run, or she cleared her throat, do something. Right, Jalen muttered, shifting on the narrow cot. So the hormone spike is still active. Obviously, they both stared at opposite walls for a moment. Then Lyra said, You know, for a guy trained in military tactics, you're handling this with impressive restraint. I'm not dead yet. Am I? She smirked faintly. I've had Terran diplomats flustered by a handshake. You're barely blinking. I've been shot at by insectoids with acid rifles. This, he gestured vaguely between them. Manageable. Her expression softened. Thank you. For what? For not making this weird. It's already weird. Well, not creepy weird, just situation weird. I'll take that as a compliment. She hesitated, then reached out, fingertips brushing his forearm. Her touch was light, intentional. Jalen, he looked at her, her golden eyes locked with his. I'm scared. Those two words struck harder than any battle report ever had. He didn't speak, didn't joke, just reached for her hand and held it. I've got you, he said. I won't let anything happen to you. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The storm raged. The ship trembled, but inside the warmth of the emergency lights and their shared breath, something settled. Something shifted. Lyra leaned in slightly, her voice soft. Is this where you tell me I'm more trouble than I'm worth? He smiled. Definitely. But I've always had a thing for lost causes, she snorted. Charming. A pause, then she said, almost reluctantly, the symptoms. They respond to proximity, meaning touch, connection. It can help regulate the hormone spikes. Jalen raised an eyebrow. You're saying cuddling is medicinal now for Varelians in heat crisis mode? Yes. He looked at her, expression unreadable. Permission to initiate regulated cuddling protocol? Then Lyra blinked, then laughed. Genuine, unfiltered, almost surprised by herself. You're such a Terran, and yet here you are, choosing to be stuck in a metal can with me. Don't remind me. But she didn't stop him when he scooted closer. Didn't flinch when he wrapped his arm around her. Didn't argue when her head found its way to the crook of his neck. Time passed strangely after that. The storm outside blurred the line between hours and minutes, between wakefulness and sleep. Inside, heat radiated between them, not just physical, but emotional. Unspoken things hovered at the edges of their shared breath gratitude, attraction, confusion, the sense that something irreversible had begun. At one point, Jalen whispered, if your father finds out about this, I'm going to be court-martialed, vaporized, and banned from Varelian airspace. Lyra mumbled. That's assuming we tell him anything. He chuckled. You planning to lie to your whole species? No, she whispered. Just to myself. About why I let you hold me this long? Another pause. Then I don't mind. Though. Later, Jalen rose quietly, leaving her sleeping soundly against the pillow. He checked the main panel. The storm was weakening. Power had stabilized. He might be able to reach the emergency beacon soon, but standing there, looking back at the small, curled figure wrapped in his thermal blanket, Jalen realized something else. He wasn't just trying to keep her alive anymore. He wanted her to live, to laugh, to keep making sarcastic comments about Shrek and defy diplomatic protocol and spin in the desert sunlight like an idiot. He wanted her, and that was a problem, because once they reached the capital, this ended, or at least, it was supposed to. The storm passed during the night. By morning, the world outside the Hermes looked like an alien canvas wiped clean. The dunes had shifted, erasing the crash furrow. Red sand had half buried the landing gear. Only the tip of the solar array remained above the surface, blinking faintly under the first golden light of Solara's twin suns. Inside the ship, it was warm, still, almost peaceful. Commander Jalen Cross woke first, stretched, and immediately regretted it. His back was sore from sleeping in a cramped cot with a very warm, very curvy alien tucked against him like a personal heat generator. He shifted, trying not to wake Lyra Valen, whose silver hair spilled across his chest like a cosmic waterfall. Her breathing was soft, calm, peaceful. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Something had changed, and it wasn't just the physical closeness, or the biological awkwardness, or the hilariously memorable incident involving her butt and an angry cactus. No, it was her. The Lyra he'd met 5 days ago would have sneered at him for not owning a silk flight chair. The one lying beside him now had braved a storm, faced her own physiology going haywire, and leaned into his arms not out of duty but trust. He wasn't ready for this, but damn, he wanted it. Lyra woke with a groggy sound, halfway between a sigh and a feline stretch. She blinked up at him, amber eyes still hazy. I'm dreaming, right, she mumbled. We're not actually in a sand-filled tin can cuddling after I had a hormone spiral and insulted your species' taste in sitcoms. Jalen smiled faintly. Afraid not. Stars preserve me, she groaned. You're better, he said, brushing a cool palm across her forehead. No more fever. Vital signs steady. Hormones calmer. She sat up slowly. Then I guess the cycle's passed. Seems like it, but something in her voice was guarded. She shifted to the edge of the cot, pulling the blanket around herself like armor. Her expression vulnerable. Conflicted wasn't the usual sharp sarcasm he'd grown used to. Jalen tilted his head. Talk to me. She didn't meet his eyes. When we reach the capital, she said quietly, there's going to be a welcoming party. Expected. My father will be there. Also expected. And the man I'm supposed to marry? Silence dropped into the room like a weight. Jalen blinked. Oh. Lyra nodded. It's not love. It's politics. Alliance building. Tani tradition. My father arranged it years ago, so it's not optional. In Tani culture, marriage is duty. Love is recreational. Jalen stared at her, heart sinking. And what about us? She flinched. I don't know, she admitted. Before this trip, I didn't even like humans. I thought your kind was loud and emotional and reckless. Charming. And then you ruined everything, she added, looking at him now. By being better than what I was taught to expect. By saving me, listening, not making me feel weak for breaking. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. She stood, wrapping the blanket tighter. I don't want to belong to someone who doesn't know me, but my father, he won't see it that way. Jalen stepped forward. So don't go through with it. It's not that simple. Why not? Because I don't want you to get executed by a Tani honor tribunal. Well, he said dryly, that's considerate. She offered a faint, bittersweet smile. See, you're already rubbing off on me. Then her expression changed, subtle, concerned. She reached for the scanner. Something wrong, he asked. Just checking something. She ran the device over her abdomen, then froze. What is it? She didn't answer immediately. Then, slowly, she turned the scanner toward him. He read the results, once, twice, then blinked. That's not possible. It is, she said softly. For Varelians, especially during an active cycle, conception is almost immediate. Accelerated development. Jalen ran a hand through his hair. So you're saying you're pregnant, she finished, roughly 2 weeks by human measure, biologically confirmed. He sat heavily on the edge of the cot, jaw slack. Oh, I know. That's fast. Tell me about it. They stared at each other, and in that silence, 100 unspoken things passed between them. Fear, awe, disbelief, the sense that something huge, something irreversible had just happened. Does your father know this can happen? Jalen asked. She nodded slowly. Yes, but it's so rare. He never considered it. Varelian human hybrids are almost mythical. The last recorded case was a century ago, and now it's us. Yes. A beat, then Jalen stood. Well, hell. Lyra laughed a dry, surprised sound. I thought you'd panic. I am panicking. On the inside, I'm just very good at hiding it under layers of sarcasm. She stepped closer. Are you angry? He shook his head. No. Just overwhelmed, but strangely not in a bad way. Her eyes glistened. Lyra, he said softly, I don't know what this means, or what we do next, but I'm not walking away from it. From you. Her lips parted, stunned. Really, I'm a soldier, not a coward. She reached up, touching his face. You're more than that. Don't spread it around, he murmured. I've got a reputation. Then the comms panel crackled to life. Unidentified transport. This is Solera Control. You are requested to report location and status. Repeat, Hermes. Respond. They both turned. Reality, like a cold gust of air, swept in. Lyra whispered, starting. Jalen took a breath. Then let's finish it. The capital of Solera rose like a mirage out of the desert. Towering crystal spires shimmered under twin suns, each structure curved with graceful alien elegance. like glass grown instead of built. Between them flowed airways of skimmers, diplomatic banners flapping in the breeze, and below all eyes turned toward the docking pads, where the Hermes approached on an emergency flight vector. Commander Jalen Cross stood in the cockpit beside Lyra Valen, hands tight on the controls. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. They knew what waited at the landing zone: diplomats, military, royal guards, and Lyra's father. The man who had sent her here to seal a political alliance only for her to return half-burned, hormone-wrecked, bonded to a human, and visibly pregnant. Diplomacy was about to get messy. They touched down on Pad 7 to a welcome committee that looked like a firing squad. Rows of tawny officials in flowing robes stood alongside Terran officers in crisp uniforms. Hover cameras buzzed overhead, and at the center, tall, severe, unmistakable, stood Ambassador Varel Valen. Lyra swallowed hard. Jalen gave her a quick glance. "Still time to pretend I kidnapped you." She smirked. Tempting. The hatch opened. Heat hit them first, then silence. They stepped out together. Immediately. Varel's amber eyes locked on them and narrowed. "Daughter," he said, voice like cracked obsidian. "You are late." Lyra inclined her head coolly. "We encountered complications." "I can see that," he said icily, gaze sliding to Jalen. "And the Terran commander is still." "Attached before Jalen could respond," Lyra said firmly. "He saved my life. Multiple times." "A heroic courier," Virel said, voice laced with scorn. "Perhaps I should award him a medal." After the wedding, that was it. Jalen stepped forward. "There won't be a wedding." Gasps rippled across the tawny delegation. Varel turned to him slowly. "Excuse me, Lyra has chosen. She's not some contract. She's a person." "You forget yourself, human," Virel growled. "You are not part of this discussion." "I am," Jalen said. "Because Lyra and I are bonded." Silence. Dead. Cold. Varel's nostrils flared. "That is impossible." Lyra stepped up beside Jalen, lifting her chin. "It happened. You would shame our name like this," Varel demanded. With a Terran, a soldier, she met his fury with calm. "I would choose someone who respects me." Varel's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "This bond, if true, can still be undone. I will consult the elders. You will be cleansed." "I'm pregnant," Lyra said. The words hit like a plasma grenade. Varel staggered back half a step. Jalen instinctively stepped between them as voices erupted, tawny advisors whispering, Terran officers exchanging alarmed looks. Virel's voice was low. "You lie?" Lyra touched her abdomen. "Confirmed by medical scan. Verified by your own embassy AI on transmission. This bond cannot be severed. The child will not protect you from consequence." "I don't need protection. I need recognition." Her voice rose clear and strong. "I am not a pawn in your diplomatic games. I will not marry for politics. I will not suppress who I am to suit a legacy I never agreed to uphold. You shame your bloodline." "No," she said, her voice trembling but proud. "I honor it by choosing truth over tradition." Varel turned to Jalen, his expression murderous. "And you? What do you want?" Jalen met his gaze without flinching. "I want what's best for her, and for our child, whether that includes your approval or not." For a long, deadly moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Varel turned away. "Guards, escort them to the embassy." "Isolation chamber." What Lyra snapped. I can," her father said coldly, "until the council convenes, and the elders determine how to proceed. Neither of you will leave Solaran ground. You have endangered a political alliance 6 years in the making. You have embarrassed this house. You have fallen in love." Jalen interrupted. The entire landing pad went silent again. Lyra blinked. Jalen turned to her. "Yeah," he said softly. "That's what this is." Her breath caught. She opened her mouth to speak, but the guards were already approaching. "Don't fight them," Jalen murmured. "Let them process. Let them see." She nodded faintly, her hand finding his. They walked into custody together, shoulder to shoulder, unshaken. That night, in separate isolation chambers of polished glass and surveillance drones, Lyra pressed her hand to the window between them. Jalen mirrored it. No words were exchanged. They didn't need them, because love, real love, had never needed permission, and neither did they. No human has ever survived the trial of worth. That was the first thing Jalen Cross heard when he stepped into the arena. It wasn't spoken as a threat, it was a warning. The Varelian elders sat in silence atop their obsidian dais. Below them, thousands of spectators filled the crystalline amphitheater family lines. Nobles, warriors, and politicians. Among them, in ceremonial bindings, stood Lyra Valen, her silver hair braided and her eyes fierce. Across from her father, across from the council, Jalen stood alone in simple garb. No weapons, no armor, just grit. "Are you ready?" Commander Cross intoned the High Elder. Jalen's jaw clenched. "Ready as I'll ever be." "Then let the trial begin." Trial I the mind. The arena shimmered, reality twisted. Suddenly, Jalen wasn't standing in sand and crystal anymore. He was aboard the Hermes. Smoke filled the cockpit. Sparks rained from the ceiling, and he was alone. No, not alone. Screams echoed, voices of his old squad. Rigelian conflict, an ambush. His crew dying one by one. Repeating, "Jalen, we trusted you." He turned, heart racing, and saw their faces, his comrades. Burned, bleeding. "You failed us." "No," he whispered. "I didn't. You ran. You let us die." He dropped to his knees. But then, another voice. Soft, grounding. "Jalen." Lyra's voice. Not angry, not accusing. Real. He closed his eyes. "I know who I am," he whispered. "I carry them with me, but they don't own me." The illusions cracked. The smoke cleared. He stood, alone again, and passed. Trial 2. The body. No break. No pause. 3 Varelian warriors stepped into the ring, towering, armored, armed with curved blades. Jalen cracked his knuckles. "Let's dance." The first charge. Jalen ducked, countered, disarmed. Second came from behind. He rolled, used the opponent's momentum, slammed him to the ground. The third was faster, stronger. Blade to blade, they clashed. Jalen bled, bruised, but didn't yield. He fought like a soldier with something to lose, and someone to fight for. Minutes later, all 3 warriors lay on the arena floor alive, but defeated. Jalen stood, chest heaving. The crowd murmured, and he passed. Trial 3, the spirit. This was no combat, no illusions. He was led into a dark chamber, a space older than Solara itself. At its center, a pulsing orb of golden white light. "Touch it," whispered the spirit elder. "It will judge the purity of your purpose." Jalen stepped forward, placed his palms on the orb. At first nothing, then everything. He saw Lyra, not as she appeared, but as she was, every layer, every pain, every truth. He saw their unborn child, a flicker of light. He saw himself scarred, stubborn, mortal, but honest. The orb pulsed, once, twice, and then exploded in light. When Jalen opened his eyes, the elders were standing. Silence reigned. The High Elder spoke. "The trial is complete. The bond is true." Back in the amphitheater, Lyra broke protocol. She ran across the floor barefoot, unbound, unapologetic, and launched herself into Jalen's arms. He caught her. She kissed him hard, raw, grateful. The crowd erupted, cheers, gasps, some outrage, but more awe. Even Ambassador Varel Valen, seated in cold fury, said nothing. Because even he deep down had seen it. The bond wasn't rebellion, it was destiny. That night, in their assigned chambers, Lyra dressed Jalen's wounds herself. "You stubborn, reckless, impossible Terran, You passionate, sarcastic, unpredictable alien. He shot back. She smiled, pressing her forehead to his. I think I love you. He pulled her close. Good, he whispered, because I already do. And outside, on the glowing balconies of Solara's highest spires, the stars bore witness to the love that had rewritten fate. The council's final ruling was read beneath Solara's twin moons. Thousands gathered in the central plaza, where crystal obelisks pulsed with blue-white energy, casting long shadows on the ancient stones. Virelian tradition dictated that rulings of great consequence be announced under starlight to remind all present of their place in the greater cosmic order. Jalen Cross stood beside Lyra Valen, her hand resting gently atop the curve of her stomach, now slightly visible beneath flowing ceremonial fabric. The High Elder's voice rang out. By right of ancient law and the trial of worth, we recognize the unbreakable bond between Commander Jalen Cross of the Terran Alliance and Lyra Valen of the House of Virel. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The Elder continued, by sacred decree, the unborn child of this union shall be granted dual heritage and full standing in both the Virelian Accord and the Terran Alliance. A pause. Then the words that would echo through generations. Let it be known a new era begins. Later, on a private terrace overlooking the glowing sands, Jalen stood in silence as Lyra approached from behind. Her presence, once sharp and challenging, was now something entirely different, grounding. Familiar, his. He glanced at her. So, we're officially a galactic scandal now? She smiled faintly. You always wanted to be famous. He chuckled, preferably for something less reproductive. They sat together on a low stone bench. For a moment, they said nothing. Then Lyra's voice, quieter. My father spoke to me. Before the ruling, Jalen turned to her. He said he still doesn't approve. She added, but he's starting to understand. That's something. He also said, if you ever hurt me, he'll unleash diplomatic hell across 3 systems. Now that's the man I met on the landing pad. She smirked, then softened. He's proud. Of me. Of us. Jalen reached for her hand. He should be. A breeze drifted over them, carrying the scent of desert blooms. I still can't believe it, Lyra whispered. 1 diplomatic assignment, 1 broken ship, 1 cactus. Don't start on the cactus again. Jalen groaned. She grinned. I'm serious. That ridiculous plant gave me everything. He leaned closer. Guess it was more than just a pain in the ass. She swatted his shoulder. Terrans and your awful puns. You love them. I love you. The puns are tolerable. He kissed her, then slow. Certain. When they pulled apart, she rested her head on his shoulder. I keep thinking about what this child will be, she murmured, half soldier, half diplomat, all trouble. No, she said. They'll be the proof that 2 worlds don't have to choose between head and heart, between logic and emotion. There'll be balance. Jalen looked at the stars, and for once in his life, he didn't feel like a soldier, or a duty-bound officer, or an outsider. He felt like a man who had found something worth fighting for and kept it. Months later, in the newly commissioned Terran Virelian Cultural Embassy, a child was born. Silver-haired, golden-eyed, with skin that shimmered like twilight and lungs that screamed like a banshee. They named her Sora Virelian for Star Between Worlds. She was the first, but not the last, because sometimes love doesn't just survive, it builds legacies. And sometimes, getting stabbed in the ass by an alien cactus is the best thing that ever happened to you.